You're not my dad!
What up, Ho Biscuits? It's your girl Skitten, back at it again. So we are here to watch some overly sarcastic productions. I actually already watched their most recent video on Loki. So I was like watching that video and it was kind of long. So I was like, I'm gonna get a snack, but like not like a real snack. So I got this tamarind spoon and it's so good, but like I couldn't eat it all during the videos. And I'm just like, I guess I'll just keep eating it. So if you see me licking this spoon, like, mind yours, because I have to finish it. I threw away the wrapping because I thought I was gonna fucking finish it, but like, I don't know. Anyways, we are here for trope talk. This is fates worse than death. What is a fate that I think is worse than death? Honestly, the concept of death is really terrifying to me. So, you know what? Being tossed into the ocean, the deep ocean, by a whale. That is a fate worse than death for me. Because I might not die, but like also I'll probably die because of a I'll have a heart attack, because that's terrifying. That is like a terrifying concept. I don't know. I feel like fate's worse than death. I guess torture, right? Like all of the things that I can think of that are awful because they lead to death. But I guess if you're like being tortured or whatever, like I guess you would wish for death because like it sucks and you're just like, well, at least death would be a release. But like for me, I'm just like, but is death a release? Like, I don't know. Maybe when you die, you just like go into like Jesus's torture chambers and he takes out his frustration because he died a virgin. Like, I don't know. That was super blasphemous. I'm so sorry, y'all. I'm so sorry. I'm just gonna start the video because I took that to a real weird place. NT who's in, hope you guys are doing well, staying safe and sanitized, and without further ado, let's go ahead and get started.
Oh, this'll be cheery. Stakes are a complicated concept in storytelling. The concept of a situation being high stakes originally comes from gambling. Your bet is your stake, so if you're betting a lot, the stakes are high.
Real quick, I thought this said, I'll bet my ear, and then it said, I don't want your cube. And I was like, but ears aren't cubes, but it says I'll bet my car, and that makes a lot more sense.
Stakes originally comes from gambling. Your bet is your stake, so if you're betting a lot, the stakes are high. In storytelling, the concept is similar. In a high-stakes bet, the gambler has a lot to lose, and in a high-stakes plot, the characters have a lot to lose. There are a few stock stakes that are about as high as it can get, and they vary depending on the genre. In a rom-com, for instance, the highest stake is usually the key relationship potentially not working out. In an action setting, the highest stakes can vary. Death is the main option, but sometimes the stakes are even higher. Maybe if the hero fails, the bad guy gets the launch codes and starts a world war or otherwise threatens civilization. So basically, the world as we know it is at stake. In some extremely high power level action stories, the stakes up to planetary destruction or even multiverse explosions. But as we've discussed previously, there's a bit of a diminishing return problem with stakes. Ultimately, a high stakes situation is a threat, and if the audience doesn't believe the story would actually go through with it, the threat doesn't really land. In order for a situation to feel high stakes, the audience has to believe there's an actual risk of failure. And if the stakes are too high, then ironically, it's the story that can't afford the bet. The most common narrative high stake is the threat of death, but as we've discussed in the character deaths trope talk way back when, a story can't always afford to kill a character, especially not a main character. And we've also discussed how saving the world plots are also sometimes hard to get invested in, because on some level, the audience doesn't believe the story will actually destroy the world. So in some stories, the highest technical stake in the plot isn't actually the highest stake the audience is worried about. Maybe the grand scale threat is the world exploding, but what your audience is actually worried about is how your hero is going to survive stopping the world exploding. Not many writers will actually blow up the world, but there's definitely a risk of the hero dying in a heroic sacrifice or losing someone they really care about, or just getting so messed up they're fully out of commission by the end of the plot. But even then, the hero actually dying is pretty unlikely, and on the off chance they are slated to go out in a blaze of glory, it tends to get foreshadowed to hell and back to make sure it's got enough narrative punch. Killing a major character or severely damaging a world is a hefty price for the author to pay. If they're threatening the audience with high stakes, the audience will recognize how much it'll cost them to actually go through with the threat. If you kill off the hero, what are you going to do for the next season? Try and sell us on some other protagonist? Lead into a spin-off? Even if you're ending the story there and sequels or spin-offs aren't an issue, do you really want to risk leaving the audience with a disappointing or unsatisfying ending? The story almost can't afford any of those risks.
We're looking at you, Supernatural. We're looking at you.
Risks. Stakes building is a weirdly combative part of writing. It really does feel like the writers and the audience are playing some bizarre game, where if the audience calls the writer's bluff, the story ends up feeling disappointingly danger-free, but if the writer bluffs convincingly enough, the audience gets genuinely worried the writer's gonna do something that makes the story not fun anymore. Now, on the audience side of things, most of this grief can be avoided by just not overthinking things and taking the stories at face value with a healthy suspension of disbelief. So when the writer says this bad thing might happen, we react with, oh no, I hope it doesn't. But come on, this is the internet. That's not how we do things here. So how does the writer get around this? How do they threaten their characters in a way the audience actually believes? Well, there are plenty of things you can threaten a character with that doesn't kill them or break the universe they're in. Number one on that list is the fate worse than death. This is a broad category of threats encompassing the space of any potential experience that could be classified as worse than dying. Now, this is a subjective judgment that varies from person to person and character to character, but by its definition, it's something the character wants to avoid potentially even more than they want to avoid dying. But it's also something the audience isn't immediately primed to doubt or disbelieve like straight-up death is. It's like a healthy, sugar-free substitute for character deaths. It's very, very bad for the character, but since they're not technically dead, it's potentially fixable, so the audience is less likely to doubt that the author would actually do it. Worse than death means technically higher stakes than death, but since it's not death, that means the writer isn't necessarily losing access to that character in the future, so it's less of a narrative cost for them. It's higher stakes for the audience, lower stakes for the writer. But the fate worse than death has many more narrative uses than just threatening the heroes and raising the stakes. For one thing, due to its convenient not technically death thing, it's bizarrely seen as more kid-friendly than garden variety death, and thus a lot of kids media will default to fates worse than death as the standard high stake rather than regular death. For instance, and rather notoriously, the 4Kids dub of Yu-Gi-Oh! Changed a lot of the storylines so that characters stuck in death traps were actually just a risk of being sent to the Shadow Realm, a vaguely defined dimension of pain and torment that's totally not hell, you guys, and characters who were actually straight up dead in the Japanese version were just chillaxing in the Shadow Realm for a hot minute. Remember kids, death is bad, but a long weekend in the timeout torture dimension is a-okay. In kid-friendly death-averse media, villains might also end the story by being subjected to a fate worse than death, rather than having a standard Disney villain death where they fall off of something very high and conveniently disappear so nobody has to deal with their body or think about them being dead. The fate worse than death approach might banish them to another dimension, seal them away for all time, or otherwise get rid of them without explicitly killing them. Need a way to dispose of your bad guys without having to explain to your children that someday death comes for us all? Satisfaction guaranteed. But even in less death-averse media, villains are more frequently subjected to fates worse than death than heroes, for the same reason that villains die more often than heroes. It costs a lot less narratively to do bad stuff to your supporting cast and your bad guys than it does to hit your heroes with the same kind of thing. Also, a villain being in some way punished at the end of the story is a very common ingredient in a standard happy ending, and while some stories will have the villain die at the end to wrap things up cleanly, some stories will do them one better and hit them with something even worse. Narratively, it serves the same purpose. It takes the villain out of commission while in some way punishing them for their villainy. But in these situations, the fate worse than death isn't to set up a sequel or to make it so they could come back later, it's to punish the villain even more. Some villains do some really bad stuff, and if death seems narratively inadequate to make up for that stuff, their punishment might be more severe. Conversely, it's not too uncommon for villains to threaten heroes with fates worse than death as a convenient way to demonstrate their villainy. That's right, when it happens to a bad guy, it's a karmic punishment justified by the universe, but when it happens to a good guy, it's proving how evil the bad guy is for doing it. It makes you think, doesn't it? So a villain who wants to put the hero out of commission or otherwise hurt them without straight up killing them, immediately, might subject them to a fate worse than death to drive home to the audience how evil they are without actually permanently harming the hero. Usually. There is a bit of a spectrum here. The fate worse than death covers a lot of ground, ranging from fairly tame to actual full-on nightmare fuel, and the higher-end fates worse than death tend to be less reversible. On the very lowest end of the fate worse than death spectrum, we find the highly specific fates worse than death that a character wants to avoid for personal reasons. For instance, a character with a death before dishonor attitude might consider dishonor a fate worse than death, while the audience and other characters might think this is a bit silly to get so worked up about. The characters
please be dishonored so you can live.
Individual phobias can also fall into this category. While they might be very individually unpleasant experiences for the character, the audience usually recognizes that this isn't really actually worse than death and they'll probably be fine. Very slightly higher up the scale, we find fates such as the eternal nightmare coma, a concept we touched on in the Greatest Fears episode, where the character is trapped in a nightmare with no real physical consequences but lots of psychological ones. Also in this part of the scale is what I like to call the pain zone, a very basic bad situation where the character experiences general directionless pain for a while. Lots of bad guys in kids shows heroes have weapons that do that because it's like they're injuring the character, but they're not upsetting the parents in the audience by showing any actual injuries. These are both objectively very bad situations for a character to be stuck in, but they're still pretty tame by Fate Worse Than Death standards because they're both fairly fixable. The character in the nightmare coma just needs to wake up and walk it off, and the character in the pain zone just needs someone to hit the off switch. This doesn't have to be consequence-free. The characters can experience lasting psychological consequences, we'll touch on that later, but ultimately both scenarios come with an easy out. Mid-range is the highly specific time loop Fate Worse Than Death, wherein a character is trapped in a time loop. They may or may not be aware of the loop, but either way they're stuck reliving the same experiences over and over again, and depending on how unpleasant the experience is, this particular fate can slide up and down the horror scale. Existentially speaking, anything would probably become a Fate Worse Than Death if you had to do it over and over again forever, but some of them are a bit more obviously horrifying. On a similar note, you can get a pretty generic Fate Worse Than Death just by taking an immortal character and putting them in a situation that would kill someone who wasn't immortal. Since they can't die but will presumably experience all the other physical consequences of death over and over again, by definition this is a Fate Worse Than Death for them until and unless they eventually escape. But higher
in okay, this is gonna out me as the basic bitch that I am, but you guys already knew, right? In the Vampire Diaries, spoiler alert, but in the Vampire Diaries, like, vampires can die but they'll come back to life basically, unless they like burn up or actually get staked in the heart or whatever, right? But so in the Vampire Diaries, they had one of the main characters, Stefan. He was in a safe or something, and he got dropped in a lake, and so he just kept drowning over and over and over and over again, and that was pretty shitty. That's a Fate Worse Than Death scenario. Yeah, that's pretty bad.
Higher-end fates worse than death aren't quite so easily fixable and frequently involve permanent physical and mental consequences. There's an entire space of horror dedicated to body horror and nightmarish physical transformations which fit nicely into this space. If a character ends up physically warped in some way, the best-case scenario is usually something like a werewolf or Hulk situation, where they might gain a few personality quirks and about 300 pounds of muscle, but it's not a total disaster. Fundamentally, minus some angst, they're still a functional person. But body horror typically takes that a few steps further, and what makes it a fate worse than death is if the character ends up warped into a configuration that's some combination of horrifying, unfixable, and non-functional. In this very charming kind of fate worse than death, the character's transformation usually can't be undone and is really, really unpleasant. This is also not uncommon with stories featuring some kind of zombie virus or similar monster disease. A character getting infected in these contexts is 50% death sentence, 50% fate worse than death sentence, depending on if they're still aware of their actions when transformed into a shambling atrocity. The most iconic fate worse than death in this category is the ultimate fate of the narrator in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Spoiler alert, by the end of that story, he's got no mouth, and you'd better believe he's gotta scream. This also overlaps with a space of more mental fates worse than death, where the horrible, unfixable thing that happens to the character is more brain-focused than body-focused. Certain kinds of brainwashing, mind control, possession, and other fun stuff fall into this category. There's a broad space of fates worse than death that essentially cover the character being forcibly transformed so that they're no longer the same person. Existentially speaking, it's a form of death since the person they used to be no longer exists. Whether or not it's worse than death is a matter of debate and depends on who or what they've become instead. Now, of course, this is a non-exhaustive list. Writers have come up with all kinds of unique and creative fates worse than death to inflict on their characters. The sadists. Some are reversible, some are not, and some are basically just dying with extra steps. Oh, this character became intangible and fell into the center of the earth? Okay, so he's dead. He's just dead. He might technically still be alive down there, but he's dead. But the trick about fates worse than death is that sometimes characters get out of them. In fact, it's surprisingly common for a character with a tragic backstory to have experienced a fate worse than death as their background and potentially even their heroic motivation. See, if it happens on screen, it's a horrifying twist of fate, but if it happens in a flashback, it's just character development. For instance, anytime a story focuses on the Winter Soldier, we're usually either seeing the tail end of his fate worse than death of being stuck as a brainwashed, tortured Nazi assassin, or we're seeing him in recovery after escaping that fate worse than death, and he's doing his best to be a good person now. Or another superhero example, Wolverine. While the exact details of what he went through in the Weapon X program are usually a bit vague and subject to retcons, judging by how he reacts to the flashbacks and whenever the bad guys try and reboot the program, we can safely assume he didn't like it very much. Almost all revenge plots are based on this premise too. A character experiences something incredibly horrible, survives, then dedicates their life to avenging themselves on whoever's responsible. A fate worse than death usually has a lasting impact on the character, but it doesn't always destroy them. Sometimes it just makes them highly motivated and really pissed off. So we've seen fates worse than death used as a low-calorie death alternative for narrative and stakes-related purposes. We've discussed the sliding scale of fate worse than death severity, and we've touched on how they can play a role in dark, angsty character backgrounds to give you your character a deeply unpleasant tragic backstory. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as a relentlessly unpleasant trope, the fate worse than death is fairly simple on paper. It's the space of very bad things that can happen to your characters. And really, a lot of stories revolve around that generic space of very bad things. What are stakes if not the threat of a very bad thing? Sure, the villain of the week was a real jerk, but don't worry, in the last few minutes of the episode, a very bad thing will happen to them and balance everything out. In my dark and brooding backstory, a very bad thing happened to me and now I'm all cranky and stuff. You see what I mean? Some fates worse than death almost end up like MacGuffins in that they're fundamentally interchangeable. Does it really matter if your villain was stuck in an eternal pain dimension, or if their soul was rent across dimensions during an ill-advised bid for cosmic dominion, or if they were frozen as an immobilized statue still capable of thinking and feeling as they witnessed eternity roll by, or if they just plain died? What's the difference, narratively speaking? Whatever the specifics, they're out of the picture because a very bad thing happened to them. Right. To be honest, this trope really runs the risk of being boring a lot of the time. The only thing keeping it from boredom is the shock factor present in all horror tropes, that bit where the audience goes all, oh, ew, that's a very bad thing, alright. But honestly, scrape off the paint and the fate worse than death is basically a very simple structure of a very bad thing with only one variable. Is it death? Or is it drama? Getting trapped forever in a hell dimension, or frozen as a statue, or turned into an amorphous blob monster, those are basically just variants on being dead when you think about it. It's not like they'll be doing anything else unless the writers want to bring them back for a sequel. And to be honest, even character death doesn't stop writers from doing that, so this really is just death with extra steps. And meanwhile, being subjected to horrible torments, or brainwashing, or watching everyone you love get murdered or something, those fates worse than death are drama. They add depth to a character's backstory, but like the shallow, generic kind of depth where it really just justifies them being a troubled antagonistic dickhead for a while. Now the fact is, this genericness is not inherently a bad thing. It means the fate worse than death is very versatile in its own way. If you want a character to experience a very bad thing, whether that's to spice up their backstory, torture them during the plot, or cleanly wrap up a villain's arc by inflicting one on them, you can just slap a new and creative coat of paint on the fate worse than death and give this character a tailor-made very bad thing that is ultimately just a carrier for either death or drama. For the villain disposal method, this is often used to give a character a karmic punishment. Ultimately, most karmic punishments are just very bad things happening to someone who deserves it, but the writer can repaint that very bad thing however they want. Oh, this dude was irresponsibly messing with time? Well, now he's trapped in a permanent time loop he may or may not be consciously aware of. Karmic. And functionally, he's dead. Like, come on, he's not getting out of that. He may as well be dead, only now he's vaguely aware and capable of suffering. So it wouldn't be any different if he were, say, falling forever, or incapable of interacting with the physical world ever again, or in a catatonic state, unable to perceive his surroundings, or turned into an amorphous blob monster, or any of these other fates worse than death that boiled down to, well, there's no coming back from that one. And even the tragic backstory variant is pretty interchangeable most of the time, as evinced by the fact that Wolverine's tragic backstory is constantly in continuity flux and his personality literally never changes. Dead girlfriend, no dead girlfriend, false implanted memories, generic amnesia, circus background, doesn't matter, still Wolverine. As long as his backstory is unpleasant enough, it doesn't matter what actually happened. The stock fantasy protagonist's tragic backstory involves a quaint hometown burned to the ground by bad guys and a loving but stern father figure killed by said bad guys. The father figure doesn't matter. He's usually not even named. The hometown especially doesn't matter. It usually doesn't matter what the tragic backstory is. All that matters is the effect it has on the character, and perhaps unsurprisingly, most very bad things have fundamentally similar consequences for that character. They typically end up with a mix of angst, righteous fury, a few sexy scars if the writer is into that, worryingly realistic portrayals of CPTSD, and heroic motivation. As far as tropes go, the fate worse than death is really all just special effects. At its core, it's a very basic narrative tool for inflicting a very bad thing on a character. That's not bad, but it's also not that deep. I guess this just goes to show that even the really dark, grim, and serious horror tropes that beg to be taken seriously are sometimes pretty basic bitches.
I really enjoyed that. It was just fun to watch it and be like, oh yeah, I've definitely seen this happen in every single show I've ever watched, frickin' ever, you know? And like, especially in like zombie shows or like shows where people turn into monsters, they're like, if I start to turn, just kill me. Like, kill you, bro? Kill you? I have this discussion with my husband all the time because I'm like, if I turn into a zombie, would you kill me? And he's like, yes, absolutely, I would kill you. And I'm like, don't kill me. Like, what if there's a cure? You're just gonna kill me outright? You're not even gonna try to make it so, like, you're not even gonna try to preserve, like, hello? But I guess, like, if I'm a zombie, then I'm technically already dead or something. I don't know. I just feel like it's fucked up. I think it's wrong. Anti-Who's-In, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to leave your reaction requests and recommendations down in the comments below. And other than that, peace out, ho biscuits. It's Skittin' Lit.